To introduce to you our speaker. Reyes Ramirez is a Houstonian, writer, educator, curator, and organizer of Mexican and Salvadoran descent. He authored the short story collection, The Book of Wanderers, which came out this year, from University of Arizona Press Camino del Sol series. And his poetry collection, Answers Without Questions, will come out next year from Hub City Press. He has been honored as a 2020 CantoMundo Fellow, 2021 Interchange Artist Grant Fellow, 2022 Crosstown Arts Writer in Residence, a 2023 Dobie Paisano Fellow, and he has been awarded grants from the Houston Arts Alliance, Poets and Writers, and the Warhol Foundation's Ideal Fund. Now, this is his first time in Utah, and he's already said how beautiful our countryside is, but let's show him how kind the people here are as well. So please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you for everyone for being here. Thank you for having me. It's gorgeous here. I would fail classes on purpose just to stay here longer. Just trippy to like everywhere I see there's mountains. I'm from Houston, Texas. It's just buildings or a freeway. That's all you really see. So there are parts where there's cows and green and all that good stuff, but not like here. So appreciate it, which is something I don't have. But thank you again. Reyes Ramirez. My book of short stories came out this year, and that's been a trip. Because what they don't tell you about being a writer is that, so this book I finished like in 2019, took a year to pitch, and then publishers, they accept stuff, like a year or two ahead of time. And so when this book came out in March, I was like, wow, I'm like a completely different person. And I guess they don't talk about how the process of writing or the process of doing something changes you. That when you start something, you go through it, and by the end of it, you've transformed into something else. And so sometimes I read these, I'm like, I don't know if I do that this way, but I think that's kind of like the beauty of the human experience is you do something, and then the next thing you know, you're just a completely different person that you've either like changed or you've evaluated what to keep. And there's some things I'd like to keep and some things I would not like to keep, which I think is kind of inherent. And I think a lot of immigrant communities, there are things that you have to hold on to and some things that you can't, whether it be through erasure or violence or what have you. And so I think the book kind of goes into a lot of that of what do you hold on to, what do you leave behind? And I think that's a process. And so today I'd like to kind of talk about the art of process. Because in my writing and in my studies, I'd always notice how writers get to talk about other things, which I think is a very particular talent or a particular thing that writing gets to do. Because I've always thought, I'm a writer and a poet. Why aren't I a filmmaker? I watch a lot of movies and TV shows. Why aren't I a singer? I used to play guitar. Why aren't I that? But I think what drew me to writing is that you kind of get to look into these other things and you get to write about them. But it doesn't get to do that to itself. I don't know, like writing, can you write about writing? Yeah, but I don't think literally like you would be able to write about painting, right? And so process is what kind of want to ask you to think about today. What does that mean? Who are we by engaging a process? Who are we by the end of that? And so, again, like you're all here at a university. Sure, when you start and by the time you finish, you have literally a piece of paper that tells you you're a different person, right? And so I kind of want to just explore that for a minute. So the art of process, here we go. So what do I mean by process? The literal definition is it's a noun. It's a series of actions or steps taken in order to achieve a particular end. And so I think in that definition, you do something because you expect a result, right? Like if you cook, by mixing eggs and cream, you'll get a kind of omelet, right? But you do that on purpose. or you engage in a state of play to get a result. But when I'm talking about it right now, it's when writers do it, it's kind of an instructional but not didactic, in that writers have practiced writing about other processes to their benefit. And I'll give you some examples. But in literature, writing about another process can serve several functions. One, it can interpret the past. Two, it can reveal characters or speakers' history, motivations, desires, worldview. It can serve as world building. It can create a metaphor to convey what cannot or should not be said, and or explore a process intimately to get to a truth. And again, I'll get to why all that matters, but for now, what I'll say is that in writing, you do these things because you notice the world around you, and as a writer, you kind of take from different things. And so even here on the drive here, like the process of driving here, what does that entail? What does that mean? And why? So kind of a thinking exercise that I want you to do is think of a process you know how to complete. It can be a simple verb, a noun, or description that answers one of the following, right? Like, what is a process that makes you happy? What is a process that makes you angry? What is a process that makes you sad? What is a process that was taught to you by a parent or mentor? What is a process you saw someone else do that you don't understand? What is a process that taught you something about the world you didn't see before? Or what is a process that isn't real but you want it to be? And I think by thinking about those things, you kind of get to a part of yourself. Because as I'll say shortly, and what I'll show you is that as human beings, we are the things that we do, right? Like the processes that we engage in is what we are. And so like, if let's say making coffee in the morning makes you happy, then kind of what is the process of that? Do you buy a certain kind of coffee from a certain region? Do you let it sit first, or do you drink it straight hot? Do you add cream? Do you add sugar? Do you do this or that? And I think you start to question kind of like your role and your place and what you can or can't do, right? Like maybe it's like, for me, like if it were up to me, I would have coffee straight imported from Guatemala or El Salvador, but I'm not making that kind of paper right now. So, sometimes Folgers will have to do, or, what have you. And so again, that I think already reveals, that process already reveals something about my reality. And so, what do the processes we engage in or present reveal? What does that say about us as a people? What does that say about a community? What does it say about, a people that will have a certain process for this, but not for that, right? So I'll say like here, in Houston, we do not preserve our history, like at all. Like, for example, like, oh, this used to be a historical recording studio. That's too bad. It's gonna be a gas station now. It's kind of like, it's very quick to erase things. Here in Salt Lake City and here in the drive here, there's just like open pastures. It's just open. There's just things that don't have anything on them. And it's beautiful, because in Houston, it's like, oh, why isn't there a shopping center right there right now? And it's kind of like the process that we engage in is, a nickname that Houston has is Hustle Town, because you're constantly hustling. Like right now, luckily, I have a full-time job, but like a few years ago, I was working like 3 or 4 jobs trying to make things work. And here, there's like a maintenance, there's a preservation of kind of like a land, right? Or kind of like a keeping of a green thing as green. Whereas in Houston, we do not care about that process. I don't think we even have like a application to preserve a building, right? I think that has to be like its own process. They have to pitch to the city hall and city council, and there's no standardized process to do that. So what does that say about us, as a Houston, as a city, that we do not have that process? So this is a passage from Laura Esquivel's Like Water for Chocolate, which is a beautiful book if you haven't read it. It's a book that is a series of ingredients, of recipes rather, and each chapter opens with the ingredients of the thing. And each chapter is a recipe to make how to use those ingredients. But the thing is that it's like in the form of stories. which I think is beautiful because I'll say that, my mom, she taught me how to make pozole. And if you don't know what pozole is, it's a soup that is made primarily out of white hominy. And now it's made with pork. But the theory is that, so pozole was innovated by the Mexicas around 1300. And the theory or the rumor is that they would make it with human meat. And so when the Spaniards came and saw that, they're like, "Ugh, what is that?" And then like they introduced pigs, because pigs are not native to the Americas. Pigs are from Europe. And so people are like, well, how did pozole end up having pork? Or like, how did pork even be introduced to like cuisines of the Americas? And vice versa, potatoes are not native to Europe. Neither are tomatoes. And so like, how did Italians get tomatoes, and how did that become a cornerstone of their identity? Or potatoes, how did that end up as being like a huge European thing? But like, I think it's Peru or Chile, I forget, but like they have like over 100 terms or 100 different types of potatoes in like certain regions. And it's like, yeah, anyways, what I'm getting at is that there's a language in the things that we eat, right? Recipes that are handed down. And so somehow the soup that was created in the 1300s by peoples that, I'll never know in a way, and it made all its way through time to my mom teaching me to it, on one Thursday morning, And what is the inheritance of that language? How did that happen? How did that process happen of this thing made hundreds and hundreds of years ago now ends up here with me? And so what does that say? And so here's a passage. She writes, preparation. Take care to chop the onion fine. To keep from crying when you chop it, which is so annoying, I suggest you place a little bit on your head. The trouble with crying over an onion is that once the chopping gets you started and the tears begin to well up, the next thing you know, you just can't stop. I don't know whether that's ever happened to you, but I have to confess it's happened to me many times. My mom used to say it was because I was especially sensitive to onions, like my great aunt Tita. Tita was so sensitive to onions, anytime they were being chopped, they say she would just cry and cry. When she was still in my great-grandmother's belly, her sobs are so loud that even Nacha, the cook, who was half deaf, could hear them easily. Once her wailing got so violent that it brought on an early labor, and before my great-grandmother could let out a word or even a whimper, Tita made her entrance into this world, prematurely, right there on the kitchen table, amid the smells of simmering noodle soup, thyme, bay leaves, and cilantro, steamed milk, garlic, and of course, onion. Tita had no need for the usual slap on the bottom because she was already crying as she emerged. Maybe that was because she knew that it would be her lot in life to be denied marriage. The way Nacha told it, Tita was literally washed into this world on a great tide of tears that spilled over the edge of the table and flooded across the kitchen floor. And so I think in a normal recipe, you would probably say, like, what's going on? Just tell me how to make the soup. Just like, why are you telling me this story about your family and how someone was birthed? But it's kind of like, again, it's an interpretation of the past and like how these recipes and these foods that we learn come with that history. It comes with these stories because usually that's sometimes what all that can be handed down is information. And so you just have to work with that. Interpreting the past, I think, is an interesting thing that writers can do with process. It can reveal speakers' desires, character or speaker desires. And so this is from Toni Morrison's Beloved, which if you haven't read is about quote unquote like post-slavery America in Ohio, I believe, and how this woman kind of grieves the death of her child. In the middle of this book about dealing with the history of slavery and surviving it and thinking of what do we do now as a people, there's this passage. Just ahead, at the edge of the stream, Denver could see her silhouette, standing barefoot in the water, liking her black skirts up above her calves, the beautiful head lowered in rapt attention. Blinking fresh tears, Denver approached her, eager for a word, a sign of forgiveness. Denver took off her shoes and stepped into the water with her. It took a moment for her to drag her eyes from the spectacle of Beloved's head to see what she was staring at. A turtle inched along the edge, turned and climbed to dry ground. Not far behind it was another one, headed in the same direction. 4 placed plates under a hovering, motionless bull. Behind her in the grass, the other one moving quickly to mount her. The impregnable strength of him, earthing his feet near her shoulders, the embracing necks, hers stretching up toward his bending down, the pat, pat, pat of their touching heads. No height was beyond her yearning neck, stretched like a finger toward his, risking everything outside the bowl just to touch his face. The gravity of their shields, clashing, countered, and mocked the floating heads touching. Beloved dropped the folds of her skirt, a spread around her, the hem darkened in the water. And so in this novel about, like slavery and building a new life and a new history, there's just this passage about turtles mating. And you're like, what? Like, I think in a normal sense, you'd be like, what is going on? Why is this here about this? But I think once you actually get into and think about it, turtles are beings that inherently have shells that protect them from the world. And, once you've gone through a trauma, sometimes you have to build up that protection of yourself. And so here are these two beings literally made up of things harder than everything else on their body, and yet they find ways to have love and to be with each other. And so if these turtles can do that, why can't we, do that as humans? And so yeah, beautiful passage, kind of like just one paragraph in this huge novel about this very heavy thing. And I think kind of it reveals the desires of the speaker and the characters to kind of be able to live with that shell, but still understand that they can love each other. Here's just another passage from Moby Dick, which is an interesting book because I think people tend to not like it because there's just so many processes in it. It's almost too much. And I thought about, why is that? And so here's one where they talk about how to cook the brains of a sperm whale. In the case of a sperm whale, the brains are accounted a fine dish. The casket of the skull is broken into with an axe, and the two plump, whitish lobes being withdrawn, precisely resembling two large puddings. They are often mixed with flour and cooked into a most delectable mess, in flavor somewhat resembling calf's head, which is quite a dish among some epicures. And everyone knows that some young bucks among the epicures, but continually dining upon calves' brains, by and by get to have a little brains of their own, so is able to tell a calf's head from their own heads, which indeed requires uncommon discrimination. And that is the reason why a young buck with an intelligent-looking calf's head before him is somehow one of the saddest sights you can see. The head looks a sort of reproachfully at him, with an et tu, Brute expression. Again, I think this kind of reveals, and I think Moby Dick in general is a book about humans trying to approximate and be the masters of their world, but actually when they're up against a being as huge as a whale, we're actually nothing. And so I don't want to spoil the book for you, but everyone dies, pretty much, except the speaker. And it's kind of like this whole book about definitions and trying to find and define God or define, the whiteness of a whale and how to cook. And for all of human knowledge, it kind of almost doesn't matter. And so I think it's a book that kind of humbles you of you can define something as much as you can, but ultimately you can't capture it. It's beyond you. And there are just some things in this life that will be that, just beyond you. And so I think there's a desire to be a master of the earth, to be a master of the world around you, but sometimes it's just not going to happen. World building, I think process is an interesting thing that can capture or define new worlds. And so here's a passage from Octavia Butler's Wild Seed. Everyone ate well that night. Wu ate better than anyone because for her, the flesh of the fish told her all she needed to know about the creature's physical structure, all she needed to know to take its shape and live as it did. Just a small amount of raw flesh told her more than she had words to say. Within each bite, the creature told her its story clearly thousands of times. That night in her cabin, Doro caught her experimentally turning one of her arms into a flipper. Wu tore off her cloth and dived into the sea before her confidence deserted her entirely. There she transformed herself as quickly as she was comfortable. She became the dolphin whose flesh she had eaten, and she was moving through the water alongside the ship, propelling her long, sleek body forward with heavy beats of her tail. She was seeing differently, her eyes now on the sides of her head instead of in front. Her head had extended itself into a hard beak. She was breathing differently, or rather, she was not breathing at all, until she felt the need and found herself surfacing in a slow forward roll that exposed her blowhole nose briefly and allowed her to expel her breath and take new air into her lungs. So it's kind of like, how do you create a story where someone can turn into animals? Well, you just do it, and what's the logic behind it? Well, this person can eat the flesh of a animal and become it, and through eating it, understands its anatomy, understands how to turn into it and how to be that thing. Which again, normally is not real. You can't do this. But I think writers get to invent these things, and you get to invent a process. And so you get to kind of tap into a part of imagination that I think is rare, that you can't really do in normal life. So you just invent these things with words. And so, yeah, I think it can do like a great amount of world building. This is from Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. This focuses on, there's a character in 100 Years of Solitude that tries to make alchemy, make gold. And so here's a funny passage. The rudimentary laboratory, in addition to a profusion of pots, funnels, retorts, filters, and sieves, was made up of a primitive water pipe, a glass beaker with a long, thin neck, a reproduction of the philosopher's egg, and is still the gypsies themselves had built in accordance with modern descriptions of the three-armed alembic of Mary the Jew. Along with these items, Melquiades left samples of the 7 metals that corresponded to the 7 planets, the formulas of Moses and Zosimus for doubling the quantity of gold, and a set of notes and sketches concerning the processes of the great teaching that would permit those who could interpret them to undertake the manufacture of the philosopher's stone. Seduced by the simplicity of the formulas to double the quantity of gold, Jose Arcadio Buendia paid court to Ursula for several weeks so that she would let him, to Ursula for several weeks so that she could let him dig up her colonial coins and increase them by as many times as it was possible to subdivide mercury. Ursula gave in, as always, to her husband's unyielding obstinacy. Then Jose Arcadio Buendia threw 3 doubloons into a pan and fused them with copper fillings, orpiment, brimstone, and lead. He put it all to boil in a pot of castor oil until he got a thick and pestilential syrup, which was more like common caramel than valuable gold. And risky and desperate processes of distillation melted with the 7 planetary metals, mixed with hermetic mercury and vitriol of Cyprus, and put back to cook in hog fat for lack of any radish oil, Ursula's precious inheritance was reduced to a large piece of burnt hog cracklings that was firmly stuck to the bottom of the pot. And it's like, dang, you did that. You did that for no reason. Here you had this recipe and you ruined it. And so the world building here is like, no, actually the 100 Years of Solitude is famously, aligned with like magical realism, but here's where the magic doesn't work. And I think it's kind of like a really passage that stands out because this is where the magic fails. It's not real, and it stays not real. And so I think there is kind of like an interesting like kind of rules that this book is setting up and breaking for itself. Create a metaphor to convey what cannot be said. Sometimes a process is just a process. Maybe it doesn't have a higher meaning until you actually get to it. So here's a quick poem by Lorien Guerrero, who is the Texas State Poet Laureate. In my hands, it's cold and knowing as bone. Shrouded in plastic, I unwind its gauze. Mummy-like, rub my wrist blue against the cactus of its buds. Where it's still cradled inside the clammy cow mouth, I should want to enchant it. Let it taste the oil in my skin, lick the lash of my eye. What I do instead is lacerate the frozen muscle, tear the brick-thick cud conductor in half to fit a ceramic red pot. Its cry reaches me for some heap of butchered heads as I hack away like an axe murderer. I choke down the stink of its heated moo, make carnage of my own mouth, swallow the blood, add garlic. And so I don't know if, I'm sorry, I'm like ignorant. I mean, do they have like tacos de lengua here in this part of the country? I should hope so. It's delicious. But yeah, this is like a process of how to prepare the tongue of a cow for a taco. And so I think is there any higher meaning to it? I'm sure, but it's kind of the exploration of that process that is the poetry itself. We could also create a metaphor to convey what needs to be said. This is Ross Gay's Small Needful Fact. Is that Eric Garner worked for some time for the Parks and Rec Horticultural Department, which means perhaps that with his very large hands, perhaps in all likelihood, he put gently into the earth some plants which, most likely, some of them, in all likelihood, continue to grow, continue to do what such plants do, like house and feed small and necessary creatures, like being pleasant to touch and smell, like converting sunlight into food, like making it easier for us to breathe. Gorgeous small poem, a very quick process. But in outlining that process, right, there's a putting of humanity into something that that was attempted to rob someone of their humanity, but no, it's there. It's there, and if you want it, it will always be there. And so finally, I'm going to get to explore a process intimately to get to its truth. And this is from Hill and Owls Hill and Owls' Buddy Epson. It's the queers who made me, who sat with me in the automobile in the dead of night and measured the content of my character without even looking at my face, who, in the same car, asked me to apply a little strawberry lip balm to my lips before the anxious kiss, thus fraught because would it be for an eternity, Ben-Day dots making up the hearts and flowers, who sat on the toilet seat, panties around her ankles, talking and talking, girl talk burrowing through the partially closed bathroom door, and boy, was it something, who listened to opera, who imitated Jesse Norman's locutions on and off the stage, who made love in a queen's apartment, who wanted me to watch them making love while at least one of those so joined watched me, dressed per that person's instructions, in my now dead aunt's little girl nightie, who wore shoes with no socks in the dead of winter, intrepid, and then, before you knew it, was incapable of wiping his own ass. Gay cancer, who died in a fire in an apartment in Paris, who gave me a Raymond Radiguet novel when I was barely older than Radiguet was when he died, at 20, of typhoid, who sat with me in his automobile and talked to me about faith. He sat in the front seat, I in the back, and I was looking at the folds in the scalp when cops surrounded the car with flashlights and guns that said we looked suspicious. We were aware that we felt like no one else. Yeah, beautiful, again, exploration of a process that gets to a truth of what does it mean, right? And for Hill and Owls, what does it mean to be gay and Black in America, right? Yeah, just beautiful stuff. So what does it matter? When a poem, novel, short story, creative nonfiction piece, film, or graphic narrative depict another process, they are building a reality just as a process in our reality informs our existence, right? Stories are about people, and people are what they do. Identity is form, and form is identity, right? Like, those things cannot be separated to me, right? Like, if something is chosen to be in a form, it's because it has to be that way. And if not, then it'd be something else. So writing about a process is not solely about the process it describes, but also about those who engage in those processes and what sort of world demands them. Writing about a process is also subjective to the writers who use them, some more literal and vivid than others, some more libertine or poetic, each with their own constraints. No two writers will describe the same process in the same way, and you can speed up or slow down a process however you wish. And so, if each of us were to write how to make, let's say, mac and cheese, we'd probably all come at it with a different approach, a different history, and maybe come out with totally different end results, right? And so I think that's kind of like a really interesting part of the human experience, is that we're all bringing something, and we all engage in processes differently. So then what if we work backwards? What if we think of a process and we think about how come that has to be uniform, right? And what does that do to a human being when they're forced to go through a process? Right, and so I'm from Texas, and so it's important to know what processes we cannot engage in as much as the ones that we do engage with. And so, in Texas, we ban a lot of stuff, banning critical race theory or books, banning, or even like the idea that some people can't vote because of like restrictions brought up in the process and gerrymandering. And so this map is actually where I live, Harris County, and those are our congressional districts. And so if you look at kind of a lot of other different maps, they're usually like kind of like really clean squares, right? They're almost like a grid. But ours, a publication in Houston called Houstonia actually made a joke of it and like designed different sea creatures, like mythical creatures based on how our districts are drawn, right? And so what was the process to make this happen? Why is it this way, right? And we start to ask questions of like, what is the process of drawing up a district? Why is it like this? And so I'm going to read a part of a story in my collection called Shimena de Luna versus the Newmar's Territory. And with this story, I definitely wanted to kind of explore the process of living in Texas and the politics and how things happen. And so I always felt that laws, a lot of laws in Texas that are passed are a law as a fiction, but with power, right? Like here are like these, here are these old white dudes telling me, like, oh, like I can't really learn about my own history, as though like, well, why not, but it's a fiction they've created that I now have to be subject to. Language as a vehicle for truth and deception, or a process as an obfuscation or delay tactic, right? And here's a quote from Toni Morrison. The very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. He keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Someone says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdoms, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. And so, like, again, the process of having to prove oneself, one's humanity, why do we have to do that? And so here's a story. This is in the form of a legal document. So I had to do a lot of research, and the original story actually had like all kinds of like legal precedents, and so it was like a page or two of like, according to this statute and according to this section. When someone read it, they're like, no one's going to get past the first page. So I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, fair enough. This is a story. It doesn't have to be for a lawyer to read. It can, the truth just needs one thing. I forgot who said it, but the truth doesn't require a lot of words. And so here we go. In the District Court of the Newmar's Territory, Shimena de Luna, plaintiff versus government of the Newmar's Territory, defendant. Complaint. 1. This action is authorized by Title 42, United States Code, Section 1981, providing for the equal rights of citizens and of all other persons within the jurisdiction of the United States. 2. This is a proceeding for a declaratory judgment and injunction to determine A, whether the United States Newmar's Territories, or USNMT, actions are unconstitutional, and that it organizes and maintains facilities and services for the education and welfare of white children, and denies said facilities and services for the non-white child of a mantenedor in the solus planum of the USNMT. B, the question of whether the plaintiff's child has been denied solely because of race, resources afforded to white children at educational facilities situated in the solus planum of the USNMT, and thus violates the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. 3A, de Luna's child is a citizen of the United States, born in the Jackson Memorial Hospital of the solus planum of the USNMT. De Luna's child is the first human being officially born in the Newmar's Territory since its establishment 8 years ago. In fact, no person on record has been able to give birth on Mars. Experts and researchers theorize that the radiation present on Mars, despite the infrastructure that makes life possible and sustainable within the territory's confines, permeates down to the molecular level. Pregnancies usually do not go to full term. Hence, all children present on the territory were brought in from Earth after 2 years of initial colonization stages. That is, until De Luna gave birth to her child 5 years ago. Up until the child's 5th birthday, De Luna was able to raise her child through agreements with other mantenedores to keep the child hidden when she reported for work duty. According to witnesses and firsthand testimonies, many members of the mantenedor community took it upon themselves to care for the child as their birth was seen as a miracle. USNMT government officials were unaware of all this until the plaintiff decided to enroll the child into school on their 5th birthday. It was then that the USNMT denied De Luna's child access to basic education, a right guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. The reasons for denying the child access to basic education, given by various representatives of the USNMT at different times, were egregious and shall be enumerated upon later. Thus far, the child was afforded a subpar distance education, and an additional fee was subtracted from the plaintiff's pay to compensate for the, quote, cost of special education, a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. The plaintiff reports that her child is provided with educational videos that are outdated and racist. For example, one of the educational videos provided argues that, quote, civil rights groups adopted a revolutionary narrative that sought the destruction of Western civilization, end quote. Quote, mass migration from Latin America has caused crime and exploitation detrimental to the United States, end quote, and it refers to slaves simply as, quote, workers, end quote. The white children do not watch this video as part of the curriculum. As a result, the plaintiff's child does not and cannot receive educational advantages, opportunities, and facilities equal to those given to white children. B. Shimena de Luna from El Salvador is not a U.S. citizen but is a resident of, domiciled in, and pays all taxes of the USNMT in the U.S. as a contracted worker. De Luna arrived on the USNMT 6 years ago as part of the second wave of contracted laborers hired to build, service, and maintain infrastructure necessary for the colony's survival. Nearly 93% of all contracted workers on the USNMT are non-U.S. citizens as a result of the latest trade agreement between the U.S. and several Central American countries, such as El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Belize, that provides laborers with shelter, salary, healthcare, and food at minimal cost. This agreement is more commonly known as the Mantenedor Program. However, applicants with children were disqualified from the program. Hence, DeLuna's miraculous pregnancy and birth of her child is important in establishing a precedent of U.S. NMT citizenship. DeLuna was a factory worker in El Salvador, but currently works as a grid operator at the U.S. NMT Energy Center, which is responsible for the day-to-day output of energy to all U.S. NMT infrastructure. Like all the other contract laborers, DeLuna lives in the blue wing of the U.S. NMT in a designated residence area, separate from U.S. citizens and researchers/scientists to maximize workflow efficiency. As in, all contracted laborers are assigned barrack-like living quarters close to all labor-centric facilities that do not intersect with research or science facilities. All training occurs on site, and the living quarters are entirely self-sufficient with medical facilities, refectories, and food dispensaries. It was in this context that DeLuna became pregnant. C. As stated, carrying a pregnancy to term was seen as impossible amongst U.S. NMT inhabitants, and the laborers took communal care of the child out of reverence. Once the child reached the age of 5, DeLuna was encouraged by a community to enroll the child in school, as the resources in the designated living quarters are not equipped with education materials for children. The U.S. NMT's Green Wing maintains a full library, classrooms, and state-of-the-art learning tools. In essence, the mantenedores understood the child would be at a disadvantage later in life if not given full access to all of the educational opportunities the U.S. NMT holds. Thus, the plaintiff brings this action on her child's behalf, on behalf of all persons similarly situated within the U.S. NMT now and forever forward. 4. The U.S. NMT has declared education as a state function integral to its foundation, pursuant to the Newmar's Territory Constitution, Education Code, Title II, Subtitle A, Chapter 4, Section 4.001, which states, the Newmar's Territory, founded as research and science colony in pursuit of knowledge that advances American interests, declares that any educational institution undertaken to provide education, services, or activities to any individual within the jurisdiction or geographical boundaries of the educational institution shall provide equal opportunities to all citizens within its jurisdiction or geographical boundaries free of charge pursuant to this code. However, the U.S. NMT does not provide the Blue Wing with any school since Title I, Chapter 1, Section 1.003 states, an educational institution may not deny services to any individual eligible to participate in the school district's education program. The key word is, quote, eligible, end quote, as non-citizens, chiefly the mantenedores, are considered, quote, ineligible, end quote. Therefore, there hasn't been a, quote, need, end quote, to establish K-12 schools since Title II, Subtitle A, Chapter 4, Section 4.002 states, quote, the general diffusion of knowledge is essential for the welfare of the state and for the preservation of the liberties and rights of citizens, end quote. The U.S. NMT provides impeccable educational tools and opportunities to citizens and their children, all brought in from the mainland and thus pre-approved. But the U.S. NMT did not anticipate a citizen to be born from a non-citizen of the U.S. NMT. 5. All schools within the U.S. NMT are under the control and supervision of the defendants. A. The U.S. NMT was primarily founded to facilitate science and research on further terraforming the surface of Mars for larger-scale populations. As stated, institutions of education are inherently part of the functions of the U.S. NMT to ensure progress and real-time development of future scholars. Research facilities on the U.S. NMT are frequently staffed by, are in partnership with, or are on loan from educational bodies such as universities, hospitals, and/or research centers on Earth, with the intent to establish local, permanent institutions of education. B. The government of the Newmar's territory is under a duty to enforce the laws of the U.S. NMT, maintain an efficient system of public schools in the U.S. NMT, determine the studies pursued and the methods of teaching, and establish such schools as may be necessary to the completeness and efficiency of the school system. The educational system of the U.S. NMT is inseparable from the government and therefore declared by law to be a body corporate and is sued in its governmental capacity. C. All educational institutions on the U.S. NMT, seeing as they are inseparable from the government, are funded by taxes and tariffs imposed on all people present on the U.S. NMT, citizens and mantenedores alike. Hence, all educational institutions on the U.S. NMT are free of charge to all citizens as long as they are, quote, eligible, end quote. No mantenedor on the basis of citizenship is, quote, eligible for free education. That may change. 6. 100% of all 2,062 U.S. citizens on the U.S. NMT are white, according to the latest census 2 years ago, which does not include DeLuna's child. 100% of all 2,526 participants in the Mantenedor program are non-white. All 362 citizens under the age of 18 on the U.S. NMT are white. Therefore, all licensed teachers and eligible students on the U.S. NMT are white, save for DeLuna's child. All citizens present on the U.S. NMT were approved by a committee serving on behalf of the federal government, whose members are all white. The denial of DeLuna's child to equal education is a structural and deliberate effort. 7. Duluna's attempts to enroll her child in an educational program have been met with conflict, denial, and unequal accommodation, all in violation of the child's rights under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. A. The first recorded attempt by Deluna to enroll her child into school had her having to prove the child was born on the USNMT. Since Deluna did not birth her child in a hospital, the USNMT, no official birth certificate had been issued. Deluna did not birth her child in a hospital since she was denied access to a healthcare professional during her delivery. According to an official report taken by a USNMT medical professional on duty at the time, several mantenedoras attempt to have a medical professional attend to Deluna's delivery. However, the medical professional on duty took this as a joke since it was, quote, impossible for a child to be born on Mars. Still, a report was filed. Fortunately, the delivery was corroborated by photographic and video evidence on site, but several mantenedoras tending to Deluna's delivery. It was only then when a committee conducted an official investigation into the evidence brought forth by 12 mantenedores, all evidence with timestamps that match up with the recorded timestamp of the official report, that a birth certificate was issued. B. The second attempt to enroll Deluna's child in the education system was met with denial due to her child being marked as, quote, ineligible, end quote, on the grounds of lacking the intellectual aptitude to meet the educational standards of the USNMT kindergarten program. Deluna's child is proficient in speaking, reading, and writing English, Spanish, and one unidentified indigenous language. This rationale alone is disproved on the grounds that Deluna's child knows more languages than 83% of all U.S. citizens on the USNMT, and 100% of all citizens under the age of 18 on the USNMT. The child's language competency is corroborated by testing issued by the USNMT. C. The third and final attempt to enroll Deluna's child into the educational program has resulted in the current situation. After Deluna proved the child's citizenship and aptitude, the government of the Newmar's territory claimed that the child's, quote, health status, end quote, deemed them ineligible since they were a, quote, medical anomaly, end quote. They claimed that the child might be mutated due to radiation and therefore a possible carrier of untraceable and or dormant diseases. The only way to clear Deluna's child from these claims was for her to surrender custody of the child to the government of the Newmar's territory for testing and observation for an indefinite period of time. Upon her refusal, Deluna's child was barred from enrolling in USNMT schools. And I think I'll stop there. So thank you. I think that's all my slides. Wow. Yeah, so hopefully what you take from that is, that what processes do we have for people and what don't we have? And so you have to constantly have a process that you have to prove that you're a human being. What does that say about us as a nation, as a people? And so that's what I ask you to think about, conscious of the processes you partake in and what you don't take in and why. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening. There you go.